Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for a webinar, Handle with Care, Preserving Your Book and Paper Collections. I am Anna Richardson Thomas, Librarian 1 at the Preservation and Conservation Laboratory, Heritage Library Division, NALIS. Please note that a webinar resource document of all links and references shared in this session will be emailed to you after the webinar. You are invited to submit your questions for the questions and answer segment at the end of this webinar. Let me introduce today's facilitator, Ms. Danielle Fraser. Danielle has been the library conservator and head of the PAC lab since 2009. Danielle holds a Master of Science in Information Studies and a Certificate of Advanced Study in Conservation of Library and Archival Material from the University of Texas at Austin. She was a Conservation Fellow of the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. She has been a member of the American Institute for Conservation and the Library Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Danielle enjoyed presenting papers at meetings of ACURL, CORAL, and IFLA. So I know she's excited to present today. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Anna. Before we begin our topic, let me introduce our organization. The National Library and Information System Authority of Trinidad and Tobago is the country's coordinator of all library and information services. Beyond the Heritage Library, there are 20 public libraries, 6 co-located community libraries, 5 libraries in correctional institutions, libraries in secondary and primary schools, and special libraries in several government agencies, all administered by NALIS. Please visit our website, www.nalis.gov.tt, for more information about our services. You can also be sure to follow at NALIS868 on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube. Now, one of NALIS's key responsibilities is to promote and preserve national heritage information. And the Heritage Library Division is located on the 2nd floor of the National Library Building, Port of Spain, Trinidad, and it helps NALIS fulfill the goal of acquiring, promoting, and preserving national heritage information. Special collections acquired or donated to the Heritage Library Division consist of mainly traditional library items created by or of interest to a significant person or organization of Trinidad and Tobago. I invite you to follow the Heritage Library Division on Facebook at NALIS HLDTT. Now remember, the reason we preserve these collections at the Heritage Library is to provide you with access to rich resources. Whether high schoolers seeking reliable sources for their school-based assessments, or tertiary level students refining their theses or dissertations, the Heritage Library is here to help. Now visit us to access books, reference materials, online resources, quiet study spaces, and guidance to help you find credible information and develop strong research habits that support your academic excellence. Heritage Library hours are Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 6 p.m. and on Saturdays, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Now, the Preservation and Conservation Laboratory is responsible for ensuring the overall longevity of library materials with attention to the Heritage Library Division and its collections of historical importance. The PAC Lab, which was officially commissioned in 2013, helps NALIS fulfill its role as the International Federation and Library Associations and Institutions Preservation and Conservation, or IFLA PAC, Regional Center for the English-Speaking Caribbean. NALIS is a part of a network of 16 IFLA PAC centers around the globe with the aim of providing knowledge and expert advice on preservation and conservation practices within their region and to serve as IFLA's key area of work on safeguarding and promoting culture and heritage. We've continued our mission of raising awareness of preservation and conservation issues through our Preservation Webinar Series. In case you have missed any of the previous webinars, our previous seasons of the series are all on our YouTube playlist. We'll share the link with you. Now, several of our official documents, though sometimes a long process, can be replaced through channels provided by government agencies, etc. However, this website speaks to those cherished books and papers that are often one of a kind and not so easily replaced. So my first poll question is, what are your treasured books and papers? What are your treasured books and papers? And I want you to select all that applies to you. Do you have letters and cards? Have you kept cookbooks, novels, and storybooks? Do you have Bibles and prayer books that are significant to you? Newspaper and magazine clippings? Perhaps you've kept your certificates, school diplomas, maps, journals, or you have an item that may fall in the other category. Take a moment now and just enter that into the poll. What are your treasured books and papers? Thank you for your responses. Great, so we will take a look. And I'm sharing the results with you. And what you would notice is that we have a big number of persons indicating that certificates are the things that they've been treasuring. Their school diplomas, their Bibles and prayer books. You have letters and cards coming in high there. I was expecting cookbooks to not have as high a figure. We have 41% of persons keeping their cookbooks, and there are actually some folks who retain their maps and journals at 21 and 24%. Thank you for sharing. And just recently, one of my sisters came across one of my primary school copybooks that our mom saved from 1986. It's still covered in that typical brown paper. You know how we wrap our school books that way. And just the cursive writing alone made me chuckle. And apparently I loved science from even back then. 26 out of 37 is not bad in a term test. These are the types of items that help to retell histories we may have long forgotten. Our treasured books and papers connect us to our past and help inspire the future. So we need to handle with care to preserve them for years to come. Now, how we handle and care for our book and paper collections plays a major role in their long-term preservation. We will look at 5 key areas. First, we will take a quick look at the materials that make up these collections and how that impacts their deterioration. Then, environmental control also plays a major role in how our books and papers deteriorate. How we use and handle our collection will help them last longer. And we all find joy in displaying and showcasing our treasured items, so we will explore how to do so without damaging your collection. And finally, we will consider techniques for safe storage of book and paper collections. Here's our next poll. Next question. So the question says, which of these areas do you think has the biggest impact on the preservation of your books and papers? Will it be the materials and the components of the item? Perhaps it's the environment. Do you believe that use and handling has the biggest impact, or how we go about displaying it? What about storage? Where do you think, which one do you think has the biggest impact with respect to preserving our books and papers? Make your choice. Thank you for your responses and sharing the results right now. 43% said that the environment has the biggest impact, followed by storage, followed by use and handling. Interesting. There are no choices for the materials or the components or display. So let's continue taking a look at these topics then. First, I want us to agree on one truth. All things deteriorate all the time. Now, deterioration is inevitable and it goes on constantly. But a curious thing goes on. Why is it that a 500-year-old paper might actually be in better condition than paper from just 50 years ago? In other words, what makes some paper deteriorate rapidly and other papers deteriorate slowly? And for instance, why do some inks fade quickly while other inks in the same book or in the same document are more permanent? This is because the rate and severity of deterioration results from internal factors like the composition of the paper itself, as well as external factors, the storage condition, the environment, etc. So just a little bit of chemistry here. All organic materials deteriorate over time. And these would include things that were once alive. So wood, paper, our textiles, animal products like leather, fossilized animal and plant products like coal, fuel, synthetic materials made from plant-based chemicals. All of these things are considered organic and they deteriorate over time. Now, inorganic materials are usually stable on their own, but they may interact with other elements to cause deterioration. So, for instance, this includes stone, metal, ceramic, and glass. So, for instance, metals, a lot of metals are very stable on their own, but from the moment they interact with water and oxygen, we end up perhaps with some deterioration, some rusting, etc. But here are the materials as they relate to our books and papers. Paper would often yellow, darken, and become brittle as it deteriorates. And our books might be covered with paper, cloth, leather, or even plastic. Now, book cloth itself tends to fray and fade over time. And leather tends to get very powdery, or what you call red rot, and it develops dark spots. Plastic that you may have covering books, etc., could become brittle and very tacky as the plasticizers in them deteriorate over time. And adhesives that are used to adhere pages and materials, they tend to turn yellow, brittle, and oftentimes eventually fail. And the inks and colorants often fade, bleed, or react with other materials to cause deterioration. Many of these deterioration reactions are driven by hydrolysis. Basically, that means that water is used to break down those components, or by oxidation. Now, preservation is really about slowing down these reactions so that the materials deteriorate at a slower rate. Because again, remember, we've accepted deterioration occurs all the time, but we are working to help slow that reaction down as much as possible. Now, by changing surrounding conditions, yes, we can either speed up or slow down the rate of deterioration of our collection items. The major environmental factors that affect our books and papers are temperature, relative humidity, light and ultraviolet light, and air quality. We looked at light and UV, dust, mold, and insects in some of our previous webinars, and of course, we'll be sure to share those recordings with you. But I want to focus a little bit on temperature, because a collection's lifespan can be significantly improved by just keeping cool temperatures. This is because the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of deterioration. And so I have my next poll question for you. This question asks you to tell me, for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, it causes the rate of the chemical reaction to increase double and triple, quadruple, or increase by a rate of 10. What do you think? Every 10 degrees Celsius that we go up in temperature by, how quickly does that reaction take place? How much more quickly does that reaction take place? Do we double it and triple it? Do we just quadruple it? Or does it increase by tenfold? What do you think? Wonderful. Thank you for your choices. A close competition between increase by a rate of 10 or double, triple. And the correct answer is actually double, triple. Every 10 degrees that we increase the temperature by causes the rate of chemical reactions to double or triple. And this is a scientific fact as it relates to all chemical reactions across the board. But we're talking about deterioration. So if we think about it, it means that the opposite should improve, right? If we lower the temperature, we can then slow down the rate of deterioration. And so experts disagree though. Just how low do we go? The ideal temperature for book and paper is still one that's continued to be discussed, analyzed, investigated. However, it is frequently recommended that these materials are stored at a stable temperature no higher than 21 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But that might be ideal more for an archive, a library, an institution with the AC running, etc. It may not be practical to keep anything at that constant level, but what we should try our best to do is to keep it constant at a level that we could maintain and avoid those extreme fluctuations. Now, relative humidity refers to the amount of moisture in the air, and high relative humidity, over 65% that is, combined with an elevated temperature, can accelerate chemical deterioration even more. So, as you would for temperature, we want to aim for stable relative humidity for our collections. Now, choosing a location that has a steady temperature, steady RH or relative humidity will reduce the risk from pest, mold, and chemical deterioration. How do you determine this really? Basically, if you walk into a space within your house, within your environment, and you are comfortable, more than likely your objects are comfortable. So consider, for instance, we may have an attic, we may have a basement, we may have a shed in the backyard, and from the time you enter it, you feel stuffy, you feel hot, you begin to sweat immediately. Know that all of our treasured items are not going to be comfortable there either. So we're really choosing a space that has us comfortable for a majority of the day. Now, here's a truth that is really hard to accept. When we touch a book or document, we leave trace relieve traces of oils from our skin, tiny tears, and stress on the bindings. And over time, these small damages add up, and the stakes can be high. A damaged certificate might lose its legal validity. A brittle document might lose its unique text forever. A rare book loses not just the information, but its physical history and the artifactual value. So when we say handle with care, it's not just a nice cliche, it's a major preservation strategy. So what about gloves when handling our books and documents? Now, wearing gloves was generally seen as a good preventative measure for protecting collections from the natural oils that I mentioned that are in our hands. However, wearing gloves reduces the tactile sensitivity of our manual dexterity, and we can cause damage, especially when we're handling fragile items. It's better to handle collection items with freshly washed hands, get those hands clean and dried, and then handle them. Of course, do not use lotions or hand sanitizers before handling collection materials. Now, the exception is, when I say collection materials, photographs and film, and we will talk more about photographs in our upcoming webinar. Now, also be sure to use gloves whenever you're dealing with having to use PPE. So once you have a hazardous substance like mold or dust, put on those gloves and handle those items in that way. Now, while the structure and materials of books have varied over time, applying these simple measures when we use them can help extend the life of our bound collections. We want to be careful with respect to food and drinks around our items. Let's be sure to have clean hands. I mentioned that wherever we're handling. And I want to ask you, I have a poll talking about handling. Tell me, how should you remove a book from a shelf? Do you just pull it by the head cap or the end cap? Do you push the two neighboring books back in order to grab the spine in the middle? Or do you stretch a finger along the top edge of the book and rock it forward so that you can grab the spine? What should you do in removing a book from the shelf? Entering your responses in the poll. Thank you for your responses. Let me share the results. So a majority chose the second option, pushing the two neighboring books back in order to grab the spine. Followed second by stretching a finger along the top and rocking the book forward so that you can grab it that way. Correct. And actually, this was a little bit of a trick question because those two responses, the second two responses, are correct. Those are the two options you have for removing a book safely from a bookshelf where the items are well crowded. Do not pull on the end cap or the head of the book. By doing that, you can actually tear or break the top of the book, as you see in this image here, where the top of the spine is completely broken. You want to be sure that you are handling and dealing with books carefully. And a lot of times when we're reading a book, we may fold a page or fold a corner in. No, to mark your reading spot, use a bookmark and use a paper bookmark rather than leather or metals, which could deteriorate and stain or tear the paper. Now, do not force open bound books, as this could cause the spine to break. You want to feel for signs of resistance from your book. Only push it as far as it itself goes. And provide support for viewing books, etc. But you also want to be gentle when you're photocopying. You can be sure that you're not pushing it all the way down to that 180-degree flat angle, but instead use a photocopier that has a bit of an edge platform that allows you to leave the book with a gentler opening. Or better yet, it might be a good option to use a scan or take an overhead image as you are trying to get copies of the page. Using folders or sleeves to keep documents together rather than attaching the fasteners and the paper clips or the staples or the rubber bands. You can see the damage that's caused here by this paper clip, which has rusted over time and caused this staining and tearing within the paper itself. So it's better to use non-damaging fasteners like one called plastic clips, or if those are not available and all you have are the paper clips, consider using a sacrificial piece of paper. That is, use a plain piece of paper that can be between the paper clip and your treasured item. That way, it's the paper that gets the damage, it's the paper, sacrificial paper that deteriorates, not your treasured items. And of course, we want to be sure to use surrogates, use copies instead of the originals as much as possible for your everyday use. Now, here are some considerations when we might be displaying or putting those collections for others to look at. A copy might be a good option. So rather than having the original continually out for everyone to see, consider using a copy. And now we can get really high quality, good quality prints done that can look so very close to the original that a lot of people are able to go with that as an alternative in displays. Now, do not place valuable original items on permanent display. And you want to keep the light levels low and reduce that sunlight, which has UV light, which is especially damaging. Now, if books are to be displayed open, be sure that you're supporting both covers, both the front and the back cover of the book, so that you do not have stress on the spine or the binding aspect of the book. And if it's going to be on display for a little bit longer, you want to be sure that you turn those pages to help reduce the light exposure. Now, matting and framing is recommended for flat documents and photographs, as they can help provide support and protection to these items. Be sure to use materials that are non-damaging. So if you are getting your items professionally matted and framed, request that the materials are non-damaging. Also be sure that they do not use adhesives directly on the collection item itself, like double-sided tape or foam tape or glues. Those should not be stuck to the back of your documents that are being framed or matted. Use instead corners, which are then stuck, which can then support the items themselves. Now, always store items off the floor and on proper storage. Select storage furniture appropriate to the collection items. You want to consider that wood and other materials may off-gas harmful chemicals. So to minimize that, it's good to put a separation or a barrier material. You can choose simple things like paper, cardboard, plexiglass, glass in of itself, laminate, something that is non-reactive that can separate the wood from your item itself. These powder-coated steel or anodized aluminum shelving are really durable and are very non-reactive. Now, when you have your books shelved, be sure to keep about an inch or so from the edge. This ledge helps you to monitor for dust as well as for insect activity. Now, shelves should be physically stable and able to fully support the item without extending beyond the edge. And when shelving books, store them upright, organized by height, so that they can help support each other. A very short book next to a very tall book can sometimes have the small one get pushed to the back or pushed underneath. Shelving by size could be better to give that support. However, if you have a very heavy, those coffee books, those image books, etc., they tend to be really very heavy. It's better to store those flat. And never store books with the spine up. This can cause damage to the binding. And once we're using bookends, we want to be sure that the bookend fully supports the entire item. These are some pamphlets that were not supported by their bookend. And so you want to be sure that the bookend supports, or if the bookend is too short, you can actually add a piece of board or something of the sort that would extend the height of the bookend and give that full support. Now, growing up in the Caribbean, I know of the tradition of storing documents under the mattress. Who else could say yes? They know of that. Typically, it might be a mother, a grandmother, aunt, or someone who could retrieve that certificate from this local archive. Now, while these documents remain nice and flat between the mattresses, they remain very much at risk for being affected by humidity. Remember, we mentioned that. By mold, right? They're in an enclosed, dark space, possibly being not disturbed very frequently, as well as fire. Mattresses are one of the most flammable things within a home. So it might be better to consider a waterproof, fireproof document bag or a safe for your treasured documents. That way you know for sure that if there's a water incident or high humidity, that the items are not being affected. And these fireproof bags can actually withstand, I think, close to over 500 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit temperature from fires without being destroyed. And so this may be a better option than having them sandwiched under the mattress. Now, if you want to take your storage to the next level, consider some of these preservation quality protective enclosures. Now, first, let's look at flat documents and papers. We have interleaving. For papers that are highly acidic, they're fragile, they're brittle, they're torn, this provides some extra protection that can be beneficial. So for instance, newspaper tends to be made of a very poor quality, very acidic paper. You know for a fact that a newspaper tends to get very yellow and brown within just a month's time. And that's just from the newspaper quality and its components. Much less if you have it out in sunlight, exposed, etc., it's going to deteriorate. Now it's better to interleave those so that you are sure that it will help absorb some of the acid from the newspaper, that the newspaper is not transferring the acid to a document that you may have nearby. Encapsulation or sleeves. When we say encapsulation, though, a lot of people think of enclosing the item entirely, or maybe even lamination. No, that's not what we're speaking of here. We're talking about putting the document into a L or U shaped sleeve to ensure that the item can have an edge that is allowing for the acids to escape, the gases to be removed, etc. It allows you to quickly take out the item if you need to, but then the sleeve allows you to handle it without the item becoming very damaged. You can even photocopy without even taking it out of a sleeve. And then we're looking at folders. Folders are a little bit sturdier. They provide that sort of secondary and protection if you have the item already in a sleeve or in interleaved or in envelopes. However, do not overcrowd your folders. A good limit per folder is 10 to 15 for older documents, or 50 sheets for documents that are sturdier, like records, etc. And once the items are in a folder or sleeve or an envelope, you could then consider putting them in a document case or in a record box for additional protection. Use spacers and dividers to partially fill that box to prevent those folders from sagging down or getting U-shaped at the bottom. Now let's look at options for books. Dust jackets are great options for books with valuable or decorative covers. The plastic wraps around the entire cover, and be sure that you're not using tape or glue to adhere that dust jacket directly to the book. Tying and wrapping are a good short-term solution for less valuable and rarely used items. The tying tape and wrapper helps to keep the loose covers and bindings together until you're able to get a repair or a treatment done. And these wrappers or pamphlet cases work well for light books and pamphlets. And boxes are commercially available, or they can be custom made. There's a variety of styles and materials that are available. And you want to be sure that it fits your book well, or you can use acid-free tissue to fill out the space around the book. So we've come to the end of our webinar, Handle with Care, Preserving Your Book and Paper Collections. I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A or perhaps add your messages to the chat. But we have one final poll. One final poll that I'd like you to do. So it's a little bit different to the question that we asked earlier. This time I wish to know which of these areas will you be improving first for preserving your books and documents. Now that you've heard about them all, which one do you think you will approach first as it relates to your own documents and books? Are you going to tackle environmental control? What about use and handling? Going to make some changes with respect to how you have things displayed? How about storage? What are some of the things that you will improve first? What's going to be your first choice? Thank you. We have over 60 persons responding. And let me share your results. Most persons are going to tackle storage first. Then, looking at the use and handling and the environmental control. Thank you so much for your participation. I want to encourage you to be sure to register for part 2 of Handle with Care. We're going to look at preserving your photos and albums, and that will be on June 24th at 11 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time, Trinidad and Tobago time. I look forward to sharing practical advice for preserving your treasured photographs and albums in this free webinar. So be sure to register. And also join us for July 22nd, where we will have Preserving Art. And I'm so excited about this. We will welcome Ms. Joelle Solke, Art Conservator at the National Gallery of Jamaica, who will share techniques for the handling, transportation, display, cleaning, and long-term storage of artworks. Whether your pieces of art are on canvas, paper, or wood, this free webinar will equip you with the knowledge to protect them from damage and to preserve them for years to come. You do not want to miss this webinar. And so now we will go to our question and answers. Just going to open up. Oh, before I hit the question and answer, I see Nicole Johnston has their hand up. Nicole, are you able to type into the Q&A or perhaps in the chat? Thank you. Wonderful. So let's get to the question and answer. So first question, does NALIS sell the fireproof, waterproof bags? Unfortunately, no. NALIS is not in the business of selling those items, but you can definitely look at suppliers that are available online. I have seen relatively reasonable ones from very popular sellers like Amazon, Walmart. All of those are good places for finding fireproof, waterproof bags. Unfortunately, I'm not sure of any local suppliers, but it would be good to check around to persons who also sell safes or other items for safeguarding treasured items. They may also have the fireproof, waterproof bags. Now, the bags come in various sizes where they can be big enough to safeguard a certificate or small enough for just safeguarding money. So you do have a little bit more variation, and of course they're a little more portable than a fireproof or waterproof safe. I have a certificate that is torn in several places along one edge because it was stored in a plastic envelope which was too small. What can I do, or do I just leave it as is? So that's a really good question, and that's something that happens a lot of times when we use an enclosure or a sleeve on an envelope that is not to the right size. That exposed edge gets very tattered and torn, and eventually, as you have seen, may tear in several places. Now, getting it into the proper size enclosure or envelope or folder or sleeve will be important. Once you do that, you can provide some support to the back of the certificate by adding a cardboard, a sheet of cardboard, a sheet of paper, something that would support the document to lie flatter so that those areas that have been damaged can now be flattened. Of course, getting paper repaired requires that you are going to be using preservation quality materials that do not cause further damage. I will not recommend using tape. The regular tape that we have for wrapping gifts, etc., that's not a good quality material for the long term. Eventually, tape becomes yellow. It fails where the backing of the tape is removed, and then you end up with stains within the paper. That could be more trouble down the road than just simply getting the item repaired. So sometimes it might be good to leave it as is if you cannot get it repaired in a safe and preservation quality manner. Leaving it as is, supported in the enclosure, supported in that folder completely, and supported with something that can give the edge that flatness. Could you explain, another question, could you explain more about matting and framing? You mentioned it briefly. Was that one of the elements that you talked about? Good question. Matting and framing refers to putting a flat document or sometimes a photograph into an enclosure where there is a full board, a mat, and then a cutout which has a window, which is the window mat, and then you're able to place the item so that it can be visually seen but it's sandwiched between the mat in this way. The thing that I really wanted to emphasize, because most people aren't able to mat or frame their own items. You're more than likely going to take it to a frame shop or somewhere that actually does matting and framing, and then they will size it up and use the mat board and their equipment in order to create that enclosure. It's important that you ensure that they're using quality materials, materials that are acid-free, pH neutral, that would not degrade over time and cause problems, and that they are not sticking your item to the mat. We have seen in the past where tape, masking tape, has been used to secure photographs to the inside of a mat, and unfortunately that tape again has caused yellowing, stickiness, and staining within the photograph itself, and it was actually visible on the other side of the photograph. You can imagine what may happen with a document as well. So matting and framing are important to keeping your documents on display. Oftentimes we do this for certificates, for diplomas, etc. We get them displayed, but I want you to be sure that you're considering the materials that are involved with matting. One participant has mentioned that the use and handling of documents was their most helpful. Thank you so much for your indicator of that. Use and handling of documents, very important. One person says, this is not a question, but a thank you for your valuable information. Thank you very much for your input. Another question asks, is there a facility that restores old photographs? I am not aware of any direct facility that does that. But if you are searching for one, the questions that you want to ask will be, how do they make sure that your photographs are secured when you do leave it with them or you send it with them? Do they practice preservation techniques to be sure that the photograph, when they're doing the restoration work, is not damaged? And most times we find persons carrying out digital restoration more than the actual physical restoration on a photograph. Physical restoration on a photograph should be done by a photo conservator. However, digital restoration involves scanning the photograph as is, even with the damage, even with the deterioration, and then using digital techniques in order to fix or repair the image digitally. And so you come out with a restored photo that may have better coloring, it no longer has the losses, the tears are removed, etc., using those digital techniques, and that may be a possibility. But like I said, you want to be sure that you are sending your treasured photographs, that they are in fact practicing things that would secure your originals. One person asks, where in TNT can you purchase acid-free tissue and the boxes that were displayed? We have purchased in the past from various suppliers, but one has been Gaylord. Gaylord has a local, Gaylord has in fact a local supplier through ECCA, that's ECCA, Library and Supplies, and they provide that from Gaylord. So they ship those items in and they have them available for sale. So one question, if we notice a book starting to deteriorate, like loose pages or cracked spine, what should a regular person do? Should we attempt DIY repairs? Now, doing your own repairs can be risky in the sense of if you are not trained to carry out bookbinding, book repair, you can end up maybe in more problems than it's worth. And so you would want to give that consultation to someone who can guide you. If it's relatively minor things that are not changing up the entire structure of the book, there may be some quick fixes that you can implement yourself, being sure that you're using archival quality material, etc. But it's going to be hard for me to say to you, yes, go ahead and repair it yourself, if it is that you do not have that level of training. So I would say get the advice of a bookbinder or a conservator or someone who deals with the repairs of items like that, who can guide or at least assist you with that process. So how do you deal with silverfish or bookworms? That is a very good question. Silverfish and bookworms are not the same type of pest or insect, and in fact, even cockroaches love books and paper as well. All of these pests thrive on environments that are warm and humid. So once you have temperature and relative humidity being in that range that insects love, they're going to be present. One of the best things you can do is to control the environment. Make that location of where your collections are as inhospitable as possible for the silverfish, bookworms, cockroaches. Because yes, I could tell you, clean the item, exterminate the item, do all of those things. But once you return it to the space, it means that the next generation of silverfish, bookworms, and cockroaches are going to move right in. We want to be sure to handle the root cause, get to the issue of conditions that are encouraging the pest. Insects basically move where the conditions are right. So once they find the conditions around the books, the documents are not favorable, they're going to move on to the next. Silverfish in particular really do like undisturbed spaces. So a lot of times silverfish enter our homes through cardboard boxes. The corrugation within the cardboard provides that perfect little space for them to just rest themselves and fit their bodies into that. So you may also want to consider, are you bringing in cardboard boxes that perhaps are from other storage areas, from business places that may not have the best practices going on, that could be infested, and you're bringing that infestation home via a cardboard box? Give some consideration for that as well. However, if you do have a very active infestation and you're planning on dealing with the environmental control, but you want to get rid of those insects that are in the books, that are in your documents, you can consider freezing the items. Yes, freezing. This is a chemical-free way of dealing with pests. By dropping the temperatures down below zero and extending that time long enough so that the insects do not hibernate, and then returning the items to room temperature, helps you deal with those pests in a way that is not going to go the route of using chemicals, which could absorb themselves into the paper or documents or books, and then potentially cause a problem down the road. When we say freezing, be sure that you are handling the item well. We want to be sure that we're putting it into a freezer-proof bag so that it is insulated from any moisture, but that it can be affected and cooled by the temperature. So let's be sure that we have our books, our documents, our paper in an insulated bag, placed into a freezer. It's recommended if you're using a regular household freezer that drops to maybe about a little below 0 degrees Celsius, that you keep it there for about 2 weeks. That ensures, like I said, that the insects do not just hibernate. So it can't be an overnight experience. It must be that you're keeping it for 2 weeks and then returning it to room temperature, leaving it in the freezer safe bag, observing, seeing if there's anything going on. If you do see things reactivating, do see insects coming alive, you want to repeat the process before opening up the bag. Yep. So I hope that is helpful. So we have a question that says here, how is the best way to clean my bookshelf at home without removing books? I don't think I can recommend a method. Um, of course, using uh, I think you do need to remove the books. You have to remove the books. You ought to use a microfiber cloth that is soft in order to wipe the surface of the books, wipe the surface of the shelf, and then replace the item. By not removing it, you're potentially leaving a lot of dust still on your collection. You're not giving yourself the opportunity to examine it and to see if potentially you might have an insect problem. Maybe there's silverfish that are hiding behind the book, but because you're only looking at it on the front, you're not seeing these things that are actively going on. I remember an encyclopedia set that from the front looked entirely good. Nothing was happening, but when we eventually pulled off one of the bindings, we realized that termites had actually begun eating the inside of the encyclopedia. It looked fine from the front. We saw no holes, no active things going on in the front. They were moving from encyclopedia to book to book to book without being seen because they were undisturbed. So your process of cleaning allows you to inspect. It allows you to take a look, examine, see what might be going on with your collections, as well as to clean the surface of the bookshelf, clean the entire surface of the book, and then replace it on the shelf. Someone asked that says that I mentioned storage for paper money. Do the same rules apply regarding heat, etc., when you think of coin collections? So interesting with respect to coin collections. Of course, they're made of metal. As I mentioned, that's inorganic. They could remain undisturbed unless they interact with something else. So coins, for the most part, are relatively stable. However, if you have scratches to the surface of a coin and they interact with moisture through humidity, um, you could potentially have a coin undergoing some degradation, maybe becoming green or having some kind of rust or other type of metallic degradation going on. With respect to keeping coins stored, there are things that are exclusively designed for coins. But yes, as with book, paper, we would want to consider that coins ought to all be stored together. Let's not store coins with books with a document. We can have that interaction with the metal and the paper causing problems down the road. We want to keep those items separated as much as possible. Question: how should we handle books that have become musty or have begun to show signs of foxing or mold? We have a wonderful webinar called Dealing with Mold that goes into all of that. Now, one of the things, as with the insects, I could tell you, yes, how to deal with it, how to clean the mold, but if you put it back into the exact same conditions, where there's high relative humidity, there's high temperature, you more than likely would have that mold reoccurring, right? And so what we want to be sure to do is to deal with the environmental issues, lower the relative humidity, get the space as dry as possible, um, and then go about dealing with cleaning the item. There are some recommended steps in that webinar, and so I encourage you to take a look at Dealing with Mold. It's one of the webinars on our playlist. Someone mentioned that early in their library career, they were instructed to use micropore tape to address torn book pages. Is that still recommended? That is not a recommended preservation procedure. All tape, micropore tape, masking tape, clear tape, all tape tend to degrade in a very poor manner and are not necessarily preservation quality. They become yellow, they get gummy, they get sticky, they create stains, they get embedded into the paper, and so that is not recommended for torn book pages. We would recommend using preservation quality paper and adhesives that would be removable if need be. And as those preservation papers and adhesives degrade, they do not cause damage as the tape would. And someone asked to see the details of the July webinar, Preserving Art. Here they are for you. Please be sure to register. And someone asks, is ironing the best way to deal with dog ears and creases? No. Ironing applies extraordinary heat to paper. Remember what we mentioned about temperature? Every 10 degrees, doubling or tripling the deterioration. Could you imagine what an iron does? That probably ups that temperature by maybe 60, 70 degrees, up, up, up. You are potentially causing very rapid deterioration with respect to your book or document. Now, removing dog ears and creases could be better done using controlled humidity. So let me explain. Paper is very hygroscopic in that it responds to water. You've seen that when paper gets wet, it gets very cockled, it waves, it does all these kind of movements because it in of itself is reacting to the water that is in it. So when you apply the water in a very controlled way, so not to the entire sheet, but just to the crease, just to the dog ears, and we're not talking about wetting and immersing the item. We're talking about really control, like using a sponge to just apply a very light amount of moisture and then drying it very quickly using dry papers, dry boards to keep it flat. That is how we go about removing those creases and dog ears. Humidification is the name of that process. A question: what advice would you give for shipping photographs and valuable documents via ocean freight? That's a good question. If I'm sending something of value, document or photographs, for one, I would be sure that it is mail that I can track, that it's freight, that is trackable, that I do have a certain amount of insurance placed on the items, and that I'm delivering door to door, as in maybe pick up from me and drop off to the location that I'm sending it to. However, you may be asking about how do you package it? How do you ensure that the item remains safe? If it's a flat item, a flat collection item of value, you want to be sure that you are placing it in something that keeps it flat, so that no matter what goes on with the item, the package, when it's carried to and from, there might be accidental bending, it may fall, it may be handled in a way that even though you put a big handle with care on the item, fragile, we're not always guaranteed that shippers are really going to adhere to that. We hope that they do, but there's not always a guarantee. So let's be sure that you're putting on both sides of the document some hard, stiff board that would not bend and flex as easily, and then insert that in your travel envelope or your package, etc. That ensures that the items are compressed and that they remain relatively flat and that they're not flexed or folded as they are traveling. As someone stated, this was a very informative and wonderful session. I have so many old albums and photographs. So you're looking forward to the session in June. Please be sure to register for that. Can I make my own frame to secure my certificates and diplomas? Yes, actually, making your own frame. If you have the capabilities and the ability to cut and make all those pieces put together to form a frame, that's no problem. You can actually do that. An alternative might be to buy the frame and then do your own matting. So for instance, you may buy a frame because it might be hard to get something that could cut glass or to cut wood or to adhere wood in a shape of a frame, etc. So perhaps getting a frame to the size of your certificates and diplomas and then creating your own matting. We have a webinar on protective enclosures that has a little bit more information on matting items. And of course, I'll go into a little more detail about matting in our photograph and albums webinar, Handle with Care Part 2 in June. Someone says, not a question. Thank you for the tip on shelving large items by using board to support bookends, especially where the space is restricted and does not allow you to lay it flat. Excellent. I'm glad that that's going to be helpful for you. Someone asks, what advice would you give for shipping boxes of photographs? The duration about 2 weeks. Oh, this is a similar question as well. So shipping items, I hope my previous answer went well with respect to that. You want to be sure that those things are supported in your shipping container, in your shipping envelope, so that they do not fold, they do not bend. And that means putting thick board, stiff board, on either side of your document so that it remains flat. Someone asks, can we use boric acid to treat silverfish? Any treatments that you're doing for pests should not be done on your books or your documents. You want to be sure that those don't get chemicals applied to them. Boric acid is exactly that, acidic, and it's going to help on that deterioration reaction that we mentioned. Remember how we talk about the reactions just happening in a way that they cause that deterioration more quickly? Paper tends to get more brown and yellow. We could have further deterioration if boric acid is applied directly to our paper, our books, our documents. So if you are using it to do that treatment, it should be in the spaces around the items, not on the items themselves. Thank you. Someone asks, what's the duration for the freeze? And I believe I answered this. I said that you should keep it frozen for 2 weeks in a regular household freezer, one that drops down to maybe about -1, -3 degrees. And that way, that ensures that for that 2-week period, in a freezer safe bag, that you have completely killed the insects, the larvae, the eggs, every stage of the insect should be dead within that 2-week period. And if it's not, you repeat it again, right? When you see the item thawed out and you're taking a look at it through that freezer safe bag, if it's not, repeat the freezing one more time. Someone asked, I have a book that was passed down from my grandfather, and I would like to know the best steps to start preserving it, to prevent further deterioration, steps that I can take at home. And in fact, a lot of these steps that I mentioned in this webinar, and the recording would be sent to everyone registered once we have it live on the YouTube. There are definitely some steps that you could implement at home that are pretty cost effective. We also have a webinar done a couple of years ago called Nil to Low Cost Collection Care, and that has a number of things that are not as expensive, and we're just kind of, helping persons who may be limited budget wise or access wise to implement steps that are considering. So definitely you can begin that preservation by doing some of the things we mentioned as it relates to our collection. We're looking at the environment. Where do you have the book stored? How are you using it? Are you very careful in using and accessing it? If you ever do put it on display, are you careful about that as well? And where do you have it stored? How is it stored? Does it have a book cover, book jacket on it? Are you ensuring that you're keeping those spaces clean and clear of food? Those are all of the things from this webinar that you can apply at home. Someone asked, there are times the air conditioning can be non-functional for months, even years at a school library. What can be done about the dust that affects preservation tremendously? Yes, with respect to dust, and especially more so us in the Caribbean, we are very much affected by the Sahara dust that comes across the Atlantic. You could have quite a significant dust buildup. We have had, again, a webinar that was dedicated entirely to dust and surface particulates. It speaks on how you should go about carefully cleaning and dusting items. What type of materials do you use? Do you use brushes? Do you use vacuums? Should you use cloths? All of those details are in that wonderful webinar as it relates to dust and dealing with dust with our collection. We, of course, would send a link to all of our webinars, but just very quickly, you removing the dust in a safer manner from our collection items so that they do not accumulate and potentially cause staining on the items is important. And so a regular schedule of getting the items clean, getting them dusted safely is going to be important for that library. Someone wrote, the edges of some books tend to become discolored over time. Is there anything that can be used to remove the discoloration or brighten the edges? Unfortunately, once paper is discolored and stained, there may not be much that can be done beyond a conservation treatment. And conservation treatment involves that aspect of perhaps doing aqueous or water-based treatments to help remove the staining, but that's not always a guarantee that that stain would actually be removed. So unfortunately, there may not be much of an option as it relates to getting the edges discolored, etc. I know there are some book collectors who go the route of shaving off the discolored edge. You are potentially losing some of the historic or artifactual quality of the book itself when you do that shaving and that trimming of the edge. But again, it's a decision that could be made on your end. But beyond that, there's really not much that could be done that would guarantee the edges becoming bright. Now, someone asked, this webinar series is really informative and helpful. Does NALIS provide conservation and preservation advice as a service? Surely we do. Feel free to email me for more information as it relates to your institution, and we can connect and go through the process of how do you get us to perform a preservation site visit to your institution in order to provide that advice and assistance. Thank you for your comment regarding the session being informative. Someone asks, what is the best way to shelf and store large old book volumes, upright or horizontal? Over time, the base of the spine becomes damaged when shelved vertically. Yes, it's important that large volumes are shelved flat. And I think I mentioned that as well. You want to be sure that, especially very, very big volumes that are registers or coffee table books, or those that have really dense pages, If they are stored upright, the pages themselves pull away from the binding, and that can actually loosen and weaken the binding over time. By storing them flat, it's better. But of course, one caveat with respect to storing flat, you ought not to be having now a stack of several books that are stored flat. These are heavy books. So imagine what's going on with the book at the bottom that has 3 or 4 books stuck on top of it. Limit it as best as you can. Of course, you're limited by space, yes. But as best as you can, let's limit the number of books that are stacked one on top of each other horizontally, especially if they're very large volumes. How healthy is an environment for books when the air conditioner is turned off every afternoon and on weekends? Now, with respect to an institution, that's something that can actually be monitored. It would be good to take a look at our, we have a webinar that looks at some of those environmental issues at libraries and archives. Switching off the AC and the air conditioning, if it does create an extreme swing or extreme fluctuation in temperature and relative humidity, that can cause some ongoing problems. However, if the building envelope is one that remains pretty tight, no doors are being opened, no regular activity going on, the windows are sealed, etc., you find that the temperature drop tends to be a lot slower in a building like that. And so it means when you return the next day, you're not having as much of a big swing and fluctuation. But the only way you're going to know is by measuring, by putting in an environmental monitor, something that can track the temperature and the relative humidity, and that would allow you to see for sure. Someone asks, what is your opinion on mothballs as a pest control measure? Mothballs are very effective against insects. Uh, but however, they are rather toxic to people. In fact, did you know that in the UK they have banned mothballs from use just based off of their carcinogenic properties? So I would say with caution. Of course, any measure that you're implementing should not be done in very close proximity to your books or your papers and your documents. However, if you are placing it in spaces around, you just want to be sure that it's well ventilated. But I kind of am very wary of using chemicals that could potentially give me cancer. So I would stay away as much as possible from items like that. And yes, this webinar will be available as a recording on our YouTube channel. Being a registered participant, you will be one of the first people to receive that YouTube link when it goes live. Someone asked, in terms of air conditioning, at our library we have an AC on 24/7, but however on holidays, for example, when the campus is closed for 2 weeks for Christmas, the AC is switched off because the AC units sometimes leak and cause flooding. So it's kind of the question is this a good practice? So between a rock and a hard place. So we have ACs that could be faulty and causing a further problem of leaks and floods. But then you're also dealing with having a space enclosed for an extended period in the Caribbean without that good air control. One of the suggestions that I've seen in the past, but again, I can't say for sure, would be to help encourage some level of cross ventilation. So this is done where top window and a bottom window across a space is open in order to encourage the air, hot air that is, to kind of flow. Well, it might be the other way, hot air to flow from one space to the other and to just kind of keep up some level of circulation when a space is enclosed. But of course, we're dealing then with possible security issues. We're dealing then possibly with access to allowing pests to come into our spaces, etc. So again, it's all these things that we do have to weigh. Would it make more sense to have the AC switched on occasionally during the 2 weeks, just to kind of, keep things going, keep things regularly at bay, or do we implement a secondary measure? So it's really about weighing the risk involved with respect to both things. And we are needing to come to our end pretty soon. I thank you for all of your comments. Someone asked for home preservation. Is AC recommended? I actually don't use the AC at home, mostly for environmental sustainability. I know when I mention that aspect of environmental control and thinking about a location at home, we're looking at just general locations. Where is it at home that has the coolest and the driest spaces? And so just making the best choice with what you have is going to be the best thing that you can do. Ideally, yes, we want to be sure that we're as dry and as cool as possible. And yes, air conditioning can help with that. But if we don't have that in place, what's the next best? And so let's take a look at the general space and which space is actually probably better during the most part of the day as it relates to being dry and being cooler, right? Someone asks, where can we locate the webinars? And you can find them on the NALIS YouTube channel. You're looking up YouTube and you would see it under NALIS, NALIS 868. And the Preservation Webinar Series is a playlist on the NALIS channel. Thank you. We're getting to our last few questions. I know ideally it is recommended to have books and staff in separate spaces. However, what can be done to minimize deterioration of books when the situation is not ideal and also air conditioning is non-existent? Yes, books and staff, separate spaces. We did have a number of recommendations in our nil to low cost collection care. That's a really good webinar that I think would work well for someone looking at how do we improve these things when we have a limited budget. It goes through the aspect of looking at the building envelope all the way down to the collection items themselves, and then even to policies and procedures, things that we could put in place that would sort of help with respect to the preservation of our items. I think that's going to be an ideal webinar for you. Mold is present. I believe it's cross-contamination. I want tea tree oil and deionized water solution to do some cleaning. Can you say if this would be beneficial to the collection? And I can say no, it may not be beneficial to the paper and to the documents to spray an oil onto it. Unfortunately, oils are readily absorbed by paper, but then in the long term, they end up causing staining and issues in the paper itself, some deterioration. So applying items, chemicals like that could cause some problems. With respect to surrounding spaces and areas, wiping and then returning an item to the surface of the shelf or wherever else, no problem with that. However, dealing with the items themselves, that is not recommended, the tea tree oil. Perhaps a better option would be to use alcohol, denatured, deionized, sorry, not deionized, isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, ethanol are options that can help denature the mold. We want something that would break apart the mold cells and then allow them to be wiped away. Alcohol does that. It gets down into the cells of the mold and it breaks it apart. And then it evaporates without absorbing into the paper or the document itself. However, as I mentioned, if you do not change the environmental conditions, you will be cleaning over and over and over, because mold is not something that you can eliminate. It's everywhere. Mold spores are everywhere, but if the conditions are right, we end up having mold growth occurring over and over. So we have to be sure that we keep our conditions in a way that that mold growth is not encouraged. However, if you do have an infestation and you've dealt with the condition, dealing with the use of a mixture of alcohol, 70% alcohol, 30% water, tends to be good for removing and denaturing the mold. Thank you for all of your questions. I appreciate them all, and I hope that I was able to answer them. Just one last time to remind you, in June, if you have photographs, if you have albums, if you have anything like that that you want to preserve, you want to take part in Handle with Care Part 2. And of course, preserving art in July, this conservator from National Gallery of Jamaica will be on board to give you all of those guidelines as to how you go about treating with your artwork. So thank you so very much, everyone. I appreciate your attention. Do have a good afternoon.